Good afternoon, this is Quintus Curtius. It's October 12th, 2025, and this podcast is going to be about the aftermaths of battles, some aspects of the aftermaths of great battles. Well, battles both great and small. And, every now and then in your reading and studies, you come across certain scenes, certain incidents that highlight the horror and the extremity of circumstances in great battles of the world. And a writer of appropriate power and literary precision can bring into sharp focus these elements of pathos and tragedy in his writing. But it takes skill to do it. And I remember reading in the history of Livy, the Roman historian Livy, Titus Livius, a scene in the aftermath of the Battle of Cannae in the Second Punic War, the famous, very, very famous battle, as most people know. It's been estimated that somewhere between 40 and 50,000 Romans died in this battle. It was a catastrophic disaster for the Romans and a tremendous victory for Hannibal. But in some ways, it's the aftermath of these battles that can really bring to light the poignancy and the tragedy. And this passage in Livy appears in his book 22, chapter 51. And he talks about the morning after the battle. At first light, some Romans went forward to survey the battlefield, and the first thing they noticed was the incredible scenes of carnage. There were thousands and thousands of Romans just mixed together with horses and men in a tangle of limbs and bodies. And he uses the phrase, utquem quique force aut pugna jungserat aut fuga. And what this means is, as they were joined together as fortune brought them, as fortune brought them together either in battle or in flight. So what this means is they were just thrown together, either when the rout was taking place or when the battle was taking place. It's a very nice poetic expression. And what's just so horrific about the battlefield is how Livy describes the scenes there that existed in the aftermath. He describes figures that had been, lying there all night with their tendons, or the tendons of their thighs that were slashed when they were maybe attacked from behind. They were baring their necks to their enemies to beg them to dispatch them, to put them out of their misery and their pain. Some men were found with their heads, maybe had lost the use of their limbs. They were unable to walk. They were found with their heads buried in holes dug in the ground. And maybe just in their last hours of madness or desperation or despair, they just tried to escape from the horror of everything by just digging themselves into the ground. Livy says that they were possibly trying to dig their own graves, and then they thought they could shut out the horror of what was going on around them by heaping dirt over their heads. But one image especially stands out, and this is kind of a famous image because it appears later in literature, and I'll talk about that a bit. The people surveying the battlefield found a dead Roman, sitting atop a Numidian, and the Numidians were North African cavalrymen that were employed by Hannibal in his army. And the Roman was the two of them were both dead, and the Roman was atop the Numidian. And when they pulled the Roman off, they could see the Numidian's his nose and his ears had been gnawed away, and it was just a mass of bloody pulp. And what had happened was these two men had been locked together in such ferocious combat that even when they were unable to wield arms against each other, this Roman flung himself upon this man and just tried to gnaw at him with his teeth. And had succeeded in doing so to a certain extent before he himself died. Now that's real ferocity. That's the type of ferocity of a battle that of which legends are made. But I'm sure that even though this description applies to the battlefield at Cannae, I'm sure that similar scenes could have been found in battles all over the world, all throughout history, both before the Second Punic War and after. In our own time, in the modern era, and in the early modern era, in medieval periods, in ancient times, all over the world. But these little vignettes, these little scenes, do not really get the credit they deserve. But I think they can say more in just a few sentences than volumes of descriptions by historians can portray. And I don't know, this just made an impression on me. But this scene, as famous as it is, or maybe it's famous because of what came after, because it's been conjectured that the poet Dante used this scene of the Roman chewing at the face of the Numidian in his own masterwork, the Inferno, which was obviously published many, many hundreds of years later. And this scene appears in his description of the figure Ugolino, and this appears in it's Canto 32, lines 127 to 129. And he describes a scene of a traitor chewing on the face of an enemy in hell. And Dante, of course, was well versed in classical literature. He would certainly have read Livy, as all the educated men of his era did, and he would have been familiar with this scene. And he certainly duplicated that for his own poem, which carries its own incredible power, which never ceases to amaze me. I'm a big fan of Dante, big fan of Dante. All three of the great poems in his Divine Comedy. And I'll just close with one final scene, one final battlefield scene that made an impression on me, just from reading. And it's the type of thing that I'm sure could be found at battlefields, great and small, all over the world, that never really found a place in history. But this is from the American Civil War. And it's found in the photographer Alexander Gardner's photographic sketchbook of the war. He was a Civil War photographer who published a collection of his photographs right after the war. It didn't do very well commercially because it was expensive to produce, and in 1866, the public really did not have an appetite for revisiting scenes of blasted farmhouses and bloody battlefields and just general destruction. But the book has been a favorite of mine because it has a very poetic power to it. But anyway, Gardner describes in his book how after the Battle of Bull Run, one of the first battles, or maybe the first battle of the American Civil War. After that first battle, there were burial parties that were scouring the battlefield to collect remains of fallen soldiers for burial. And as they did so, they encountered one skull. And someone in the burial party picked up the skull and heard something rattling around inside it. And after some investigation and turnover of the fragment of bone, what fell out from inside the skull was a glass eye of a soldier. And I don't know, it's certainly a macabre image. It's not as grisly as the story of the Roman and the Numidian, but there's something about this tale which really carries with it some sort of strange evocative power. A glass eye falling out of the skull of a fallen soldier. Boy, that's pretty incredible. So, I guess these little stories and anecdotes can give us just a real feel for just how ferocious these battles were and could be and still are. And I think it's something that we should reflect on. So that's all for today. I'm Quintus Curtius.